The hospital hallways were quiet, except for the occasional beeping of machines and the soft footsteps of night shift nurses making their rounds. It was late, far past the time when most staff had already gone home, but Nurse Emily remained, at her post, lingering by the bedside of an elderly patient who had been admitted earlier that day. His name was Mr. Thompson, a man in his late 70s, with deep lines etched into his face, telling the story of a life filled with love, hardships, and everything in between. Emily didn't have to stay. Her shift had ended hours ago. She could have easily walked out, gone home, and collapsed into bed like any other exhausted nurse after a long day. But something about Mr. Thompson's frail voice, when he had asked, "Will you stay just a little longer?" had tugged at her heart. His family wasn't there, and in that moment, he looked so small, so vulnerable. She knew what loneliness felt like. And so, instead of brushing off his request, she pulled up a chair beside him, took his hand gently, and stayed. They talked for a while. Well, mostly he did. Emily listened as he shared bits and pieces of his past. His late wife, the way they used to dance in the kitchen, the childhood stories of his now-grown kids. His voice wavered at times, his breathing uneven, but there was warmth in his words. Emily smiled, nodding along, offering comfort in the only way she knew how, by being present. The clock kept ticking. The other nurses glanced at her as they passed by, some giving knowing smiles. They understood. This wasn't in the job description. No one would have blamed Emily if she had left. But she wasn't just a nurse. She was a person who cared, and that made all the difference. As the hours stretched on, Mr. Thompson's eyes grew heavy. His voice softened, and finally he whispered, "Thank you for staying." A few moments later, he drifted off to sleep, his hand still resting in Emily's. She sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. It was late, too late. She should go home now. The next morning, as she returned for another shift, something unexpected happened. She found a group of people standing near the nurse's station, their eyes scanning the room. It was Mr. Thompson's family. His son, a tall man with tired but grateful eyes, approached her. "You're Nurse Emily, right?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. She nodded, unsure of what to expect. Then, he did something that left her completely speechless. What they gave her, what they said next, was something she never could have imagined. Emily stood frozen for a moment, looking at Mr. Thompson's son, trying to read his expression. His eyes were filled with something between exhaustion and gratitude, and behind him stood the rest of the family. His daughter, a woman in her 40s, with worry still lingering in her face. A few grandchildren standing quietly, shifting on their feet. The air around them felt heavy, as if they had been carrying something in their hearts for a long time. He took a deep breath before speaking. "My dad, he told us about you, about how you stayed with him last night." His voice wavered slightly, but he steadied himself. "We weren't here when we should have been, and you—" He stopped for a second, swallowing the emotion, rising in his throat. "You stepped in when he needed someone." Emily opened her mouth to say something, maybe to brush it off as just part of her job, maybe to reassure them that it was nothing. But before she could, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to her. At first, she hesitated. I didn't do it for anything in return," she said, softly, shaking her head. "We know." The daughter spoke up, her voice gentle. "That's exactly why we want you to have this." Emily looked at them for a moment before finally taking the envelope with careful hands. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a handwritten letter, one written by Mr. Thompson himself, shaky yet heartfelt. thanking her for her kindness. But that wasn't all. Tucked inside the letter was something even more surprising. She stared at it, not knowing what to say. The family watched her reaction, their faces filled with a mix of emotions. "We'll explain everything," the son said, his voice calm but serious. Emily looked back at them, the weight of the moment sinking in. She wasn't sure what she had just stepped into, but one thing was clear. This was more than just a simple gesture of gratitude. Later that day, during her break, she sat down in a quiet corner of the hospital and unfolded the letter again. "Dear Nurse Emily," it began. "I don't know if you realize it, but last night you reminded me of my wife. She used to hold my hand just like you did, when the world felt too big and scary. I don't have many days left, but you made one of them a little easier, and for that, I'm forever grateful. My family, they are good people. They work hard, they love deeply, but sometimes life pulls us in different directions. I hope they see what I saw in you, a heart that cares, even when no one's watching." Her fingers tightened around the letter as she read the last few lines. "There's something I've asked my family to do for you, something that, I hope, will remind you that kindness never goes unnoticed. I don't know if you'll accept it, but either way, I want you to know this. What you did mattered." Emily's chest felt tight. She glanced back at the envelope, at what had been tucked inside along with the letter. It was more than she could have ever expected, more than she ever could have imagined, and in that moment, she realized. This wasn't just a thank you. It was something far, far bigger. But why, and what exactly did Mr. Thompson's family intend to do next? Emily sat there, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Her mind raced with thoughts, emotions swirling in a way she hadn't expected. She had stayed with patients before, comforted them, held their hands when they needed it most, but never had anything like this happened. Never had a family gone out of their way to express their gratitude in such a deeply personal way. She finally looked down at what had been tucked inside the envelope, along with the letter, a small, neatly folded check. When she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a thank you gift. It was a life-changing amount. Her heart pounded. She couldn't accept this. It was too much. This wasn't why she had stayed with Mr. Thompson that night. She had done it simply because he had needed someone, because it was the right thing to do. Just as she was trying to process everything, she felt a presence near her. She looked up to see Mr. Thompson's son, standing nearby, watching her reaction. His expression was calm, but there was something determined in his eyes. "I know it's a lot," he said, before she could even speak. "And I know what you're thinking. You want to say no." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "But this isn't just about the money. It's about honoring our father's last request." Emily swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." "Then just listen," he said gently, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her. "My father wasn't just grateful for what you did that night. He saw something in you, something that reminded him of the kind of kindness this world needs more of. He spent his life working hard, saving, planning for his family. And when he realized he didn't have much time left, he wanted to do something meaningful, something that would continue long after he was gone." Emily's eyes stung with unshed tears. "But why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you cared when you didn't have to," he said simply. "And that's rare." He hesitated, then added, "My father wanted this to be used in a way that would make a difference. For you, for others, whatever feels right to you." Emily looked down at the check again, her mind reeling. It wasn't just a gift. It was a responsibility, one that she hadn't asked for, but one that now rested in her hands. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought about all the times she had wanted to do more for her patients, the moments when she wished she had more resources, more time, more ways to help beyond what the hospital allowed. And now, suddenly, she did. Days passed, and after a lot of thought, Emily made her decision. She met with Mr. Thompson's family, again, sitting with them over coffee, explaining what she had decided to do. "I can't take this just for myself," she told them, "but I can use it to do something good." With their blessing, Emily started a fund in Mr. Thompson's name, one dedicated to helping families of long-term patients with financial burdens, covering small but meaningful expenses that often got overlooked. Things like transportation, meals, and overnight accommodations for those who couldn't afford to be by their loved one's side. Word spread, and soon, donations started coming in from others who had once been in the same position, people who knew what it was like to feel helpless in a hospital room, wishing they had just a little more support. Months later, as Emily walked through the halls of the hospital, she saw the quiet ways Mr. Thompson's legacy was taking shape. A mother sitting in the waiting area, with a meal she hadn't been able to afford before. A father who could finally stay one more night with his sick child, without worrying about missing work. Small moments that made a difference. She had never expected any of this. She had simply stayed late one night to comfort a man who had needed her. And yet, that single moment had led to something bigger than she could have ever imagined. As she stood outside Mr. Thompson's old hospital room, now occupied by another patient, she smiled softly. "Thank you," she whispered, because in the end, kindness had a way of coming full circle.